I'd like to draw your attention on either side of where you're sitting to the series of paintings that we have up here. You'll notice that they are a very, very different colour to what I'm showing you on the screen. And if you are near the front, if you turn all the way back, you will be able to see the very back above the gallery there. There is a brown one left in situ, and they are the original pictures, which I'm now going to find you an example of, that were up above. And what we're looking at now are actually these paintings were Newman's idea. He wanted a series of images of St. Peter and St. Paul preaching, and he also wanted a series of all 12 apostles. So we have all 12 apostles, and then we have 7 pictures in between. And each of these 7 pictures, so the one here, for example, this is the descending of the Holy Spirit, and each of these 7 pictures is based on a Raphael cartoon. And Newman went to Rome and he organized to have these paintings painted, and they were sent flat packed, I suppose, and rolled up, and they arrived late in the summer of 1856 after the church had opened, and then they had to go about building frames to put them in place. When that happened, when they arrived, they were in this style here. Very hard to make out. This is the only one that is left up there. This is, I believe, St. Thomas, and we have this kind of lovely foliage either side here, and different patterns that made up this lovely framing that was then carried over in the 2006 set that were built, made again for the church. And the reason why there is these 2006 series is because, unfortunately, these have degraded so much that it's almost impossible to see them, and they had become completely brown. And I think that perhaps the reason for that is that when they arrived, Newman was so worried that actually behind these paintings is exposed somewhat plaster. It hasn't been smoothed like the upper section of the church. And I think Pollen was so worried that the damp was going to get into them that he employed the painters here to put on something called gutta percha, or kind of it's kind of like an Indian rubber, and he asked them to paint it on the back of the paintings. And this would have been a very abrasive material, and his thought was, he had heard that that's what you do to paintings when you're worried about the damp seeking in. And so he had the whole series of paintings painted from the back with this gutta percha. There is also a very serious amount of varnish on the front of the paintings, which over time led them to darken. I believe it was 2004 that the National Gallery helped out and looked and said that there really was nothing to be done for them. And later on in 2006, there was a donation from the state, and the OPW were involved, and a new project was made, and this series that you see up here were commissioned. So these are from 2006, and they're by an Istanbul-born artist called Levent Tuncer. And what I think happened was that though the series of the large stories of St. Peter and St. Paul were based on Raphael's cartoons, I think that what actually happened was, during the commission, that Levent Tuncer went back to the Raphael cartoons, and he has actually ended up copying them almost directly. So I don't think that what happened was that Levent Tuncer copied what was. I think Levent Tuncer actually copied the cartoons as the cartoons were. So instead of making copies in the design in which they were up, because Pollen had been very particular about how the saints would be painted. He didn't want any breezy Italian saints, he said. He wanted saints that were solemn, and that all of the colourings would connect back to the marbles. And he was particularly, and I have a quote here on that I didn't manage to put into my notes that I'd like to read. He was particularly worried that the backgrounds of the apostles, so the apostles being these portrait single figures, that the backgrounds of those would be brown only, not gold, because he already had gold ground in these saints in the lunettes along the side of the building. And he was very worried that the man who had been employed to help instruct the painters to paint the series, he was very worried that they would be too modern and that they would have special modernisms in the way of breezy saints. And the way in which that would harm the whole church would be that the deep colours in the marble would be killed entirely if such brilliant tinctures were to be employed. And so with that, I think if Pollen was here today, I think he'd be a little dismayed at the colouring, the super tinctures, in his own words, of the original cartoons he already thought were too strong a colouring. And so he was very, very worried about that. And so I think he would be a little dismayed by the colouring of them now.